fix
Is
that?
there a way to silence that?
I don't know.
I've never tried.
Hi, everybody.
I think only the hosts and co-hosts can hear that. I don't think the rest of the
Is that true?
audience can.
Okay.
Yeah. We can't hear it.
Okay, great. Awesome.
Okay.
All right. I don't know, Tammy or Melanie, do you want to do intros?
Yeah, welcome everybody. This is wonderful. We're still waiting for a few people to join in. Lots of alerts coming through. Sorry for a little bit of a delay with some of you coming early, as we had a bit of a misunderstandings about daylight savings time changing. But it's wonderful to see so many people here today. And I think we're going to have great conversations all about pigments. So just to introduce myself, I'm Tammy, and I'm part of the board of this amazing new organization called Pigments Revealed International. And I think a lot of you, I'm seeing a lot of familiar names that I recognize from the symposium. And I think it was this amazing thing, and I know for me, and I know for a lot of us involved, to see all these people that were involved with pigments from around the world, and all in different ways of working with pigments, and how we all were passionate with pigments and dyes and natural pigments in different ways. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations we're going to have today. But before we pass on to our speakers, I first just want to mention that unfortunately Christine can't join us today. Christine Rosebeer, she can't join us today because she's got COVID and is unfortunately not well at all, and so she can't join us. But I think we're still going to have amazing conversations with the speakers that are here, and with you all as well. But first, I would like to pass over to the founder and director of Pigments Revealed International, and I think an inspiration to many of us with her art and her passion and her educational projects. And so I'd like to pass you over to Melanie Ancheta just to say hello and welcome us all.
Hi, everybody. I'm really, really happy to see so many faces. Some of you I remember from the symposium, and there are new people, which really excites me. It seems like every day we have more people, coming forward who are interested in working with pigments. And that's really what PRI is about. When I started this, it was, to me, the natural follow-up to the symposium. I saw how happy everybody was finally having other pigment people to talk to. And I thought, how do we keep that going? And it just kind of segued into, a nonprofit. This is an international organization, and, we hope to be able to provide what you're all looking for as far as, mentors, for collaborators, for inspiration and knowledge. We're just really, this is our first event. So we're really just starting to get our feet under us. And I think that this year is probably going to be one of our most exciting years ever, because we're building programming and content. We're working on so many different things to make available to all of you. So I really hope that you stick around and, hang out with us and become good friends with everybody. That's really what this is all about, is making, personal connections with other pigment people, becoming friends, so that nobody ever has to work alone again. With that, I'm going to toss it back to Tammy, and she's going to start introducing our panelists today. Again, thank you, everybody. I'm really excited to see all of your faces here today.
Yeah, I think, and just to echo your sentiments, Melanie, I've also found it amazing coming from an archaeology background where you're kind of very focused in one way, and this is all I'm thinking about of archaeology in South Africa, and to realizing there's so much more to pigments, to understand the full pigment or ochre story. And it's been very inspiring for me just to to be surrounded by all these people and to have you all tonight. So I'm really looking forward to these questions. So to start off, we're going to pass on to Lucy, she'll introduce herself and talk a little bit about what she's doing. So just a reminder to please keep yourselves on mute. And then you're welcome to put on your videos if you want. It's up to you. It's always nice to see faces, but you can also leave your videos off. And then you're welcome to, as you're thinking of questions, you can post them in the chat, or you can post them later. We'll have each speaker talk, and we'll have a few questions after each speaker if there's anything particularly that you want to get out straight away. And then we'll have another question and answer session afterwards. Cool, over to you, Lucy.
Hi, thank you. Just to let you know, I'm going to be reading something that I've prepared, but also I've got some things for show and tell, and I'm going to hold this while I'm talking, so it's not just my face. So, hi, I'm Lucy. I'm an artist, painter, and pigment maker working in London, and I make pigments under the name London Pigment for purchase. I make works of art with them, and I also give pigment workshops. My work uses urban waste stream materials to make recycled pigment as a way of narrating a modern lived experience. My practice is centered around the use of unusual, surprising, or esoteric raw materials to make color, and as a way of documenting events or happenings that I encounter. Verdigris made from copper wire stripped from burnt out mopeds, soot and ash from park fires, and construction rubble have all been used in my work to make new pigments. Using materials that have had this previous history gives waste stream pigments complex meaning. And through my work, I hope to communicate how I navigate the complexities of the hierarchy of materials. I love collecting earth colours from around the UK, but it's the transformation of banal waste materials that I find most potent. The Earth's natural resources to make pigment, especially in relation to industrially made synthetic colours, are slowly depleting. And one way to help conserve these materials is to reuse and remake colour anew. And in this chart here, I've got quite a few of the colours that I make. Hopefully you can see there's a selection of brick colours, red and orange, some collected from the Thames, others collected from other areas, kind of waste areas or skips or other places. And you can see there's such a breadth of colour that can be found just in London alone from waste. So what is the waste stream? To me, it sounds quite romantic. I like this idea of an ever-moving river of materials that are constantly being reused, reimagined, repurposed, where nothing is lost and everything has potential. There are infinite possibilities for just one of these materials. Waste streams describe the complete flow of waste from its very beginning, its domestic or industrial source, through to its recovery, recycling, or final disposal. The final disposal can be compaction, incineration, for example. And there are many complex processes that different industries use in order to reduce waste and recycle or recoup materials to save money, but also to limit their environmental impact. Most of the raw materials that I use are waste products from the construction industry and are mostly inorganic pigments of mineral origin, such as brick, slate, gravel, and different aggregates. I've got some here. So this is a medieval piece of tile that I found from the Thames. You can tell by these very distinctive holes when you stumble upon a medieval tile. Some yellow brick. This is a piece of Georgian stock from London, and also other bits and pieces. This is a tiny, tiny little bit of the Victorian clay pipes that I was mentioning that can be this amazing bright white, or even a dark kind of intense blue-black from the interior. But you've got to be careful with these ones because sometimes they have asbestos actually in the clay, so you have to be very, very careful. I often wet it. Just looking at my little show and tell box, which I'm not going to pour all over my computer, but you can see there's such an array of different colours. These are found in a multitude of places, from the Thames foreshore to old Victorian dumps, the street, parks, skips, construction sites, for example. Some organic pigments that I make are made from once living things, for example, bone, wood, or recycled piano keys. And these make a great range of carbon blacks with different kind of undertones to the blacks. And there's also wood ash and chalk. These are the organic things that I find. The future for London Pigment, I hope to expand London Pigment and make these recycled pigments available in larger quantities for more general use with the purchase of new machinery. And also, you might ask, why make pigments from waste stream materials? Making paint from rubbish releases the potential of this material for something it was not destined to fulfill. Using materials that have had this previous use and untold hours of human labour invested in them gives them this strange kind of layered meaning. There are so many possibilities in this world that are different to the options that are presented to us. Just think, if everyone stopped buying their materials and made them instead, then there'd be so much more innovation and collaboration. The recipes I use often engage with the past through using historical recipes, such as using cherry gum or gum arabic as a binder. The raw materials are rooted in the past too, such as Georgian yellow bricks that I mentioned, but through the use of these unusual pigments and the narrative in which they were collected, it grounds them in the present and hopefully inspires others in the future to reconsider and reorientate their relationship to their own local colour. Colour isn't solely this abstracted optical phenomenon, but grounded in the world that we live in, and all pigments are made from the earth. And then just to finish up, I've got a few pigments and vials to show you. So this is an artwork, and it goes this way around. It's a selection of colours all from London, and it displays the stratigraphy of London with found materials. So we have some earth colours at the bottom here. These earth colours are interesting because within an urban context, if they are you see them dug up from the road and put to the side, I kind of consider them a waste material from the waste stream because they've been kind of taken out of their context and they're going to be thrown away. So all of these could be considered waste stream pigments. Otherwise, it's very different to going and actually removing material from a context, a geological context. So we've got some iron-rich earths here. This one here is, oh sorry, I'm not holding it very well. This one here is London clay, and it's this gorgeous greeny grey, and actually it's very similar to raw umber when mixed with oil. And carbon black made from London plane trees, which is actually a species of trees which you only find in London. So roots it to this place, and some chalk from the Thames. And lastly, just to show you very quickly, a handful of pigments, and these are very precious to me. These are the ones that I've also posted on Instagram recently for World Pigment Day. These are the ones from that moped, that burnt out moped. You can just see that it's an amazing array of colours just from one urban kind of destructive moment. So there we are.
That's fascinating, Lucy. I'd definitely like to know more about how you got into all of this. But we have a question from Palu. Lucy, what precautions do you take when foraging industrial waste?
Oh yeah, that's very important. I do research the areas that I'm collecting from. So obviously there would be, I'm not going to be foraging from any radioactive waste dumps or anything, but I do really make sure that whatever I find, I clean really well. I wash whatever material I find. I always, with things that I'm a little bit unsure of their provenance or like what they're actually made from, I tend to keep wet when I grind them, just in case, so that no dust goes in the air. Obviously, I'm always wearing a high quality respirator. And some things, if you kind of can feel, okay, this is a bit of a weird material, I just don't use at all. But you can make some good educated guesses at what you're going to find depending on like the research you've done. So yeah, I also with I wear gloves as well a lot of the time because I do suffer from eczema, so I keep very well covered. So yeah, it's very important.
Cool. And then a question from Angela. So what, now it's gone up. What processes do you actually use to collect the coloring materials from the moped specifically?
Oh yeah, so that, it's very intuitive. I mean, you can see what's there first of all. So this particular moment, it was totally melted and destroyed, and so you could actually see very clearly, okay, this is the chassis that's rusting completely and fallen apart. And so it's really just about careful collection. And then once you've collected all those things, be very careful to keep them very separate and to label them. And of course, you're going to wash them and grind them. So for example, the rusted areas that I found on the chassis of this moped, which made this gorgeous, you can't really see very clearly, it's actually quite a deep brown, which is also mixed with the paint from the the body of it. I ground it very fine. I ground it wet first of all, and then I washed it plenty with rainwater or tap water, and I have, like many others do, some different grades of sieves, geological sieves, and eventually I get to a very, very fine micron, like 400. Yeah, and the mesh size is very fine. So that's the gist of the processing. It's very it's very hands-on, it's very labor intensive, anyone can do it. It's also just love doing it. It's just, the process is incredibly satisfying.
Okay, and then just two more questions before we move on to Catalina. Why, and I was wondering this as well, why do medieval tiles have holes in them?
Just that's how they were attached to the frame, so they that's where the nail would have gone. It's really simple. But these often stay intact, and they really catch your eye when you're on the Thames foreshore. Somehow I think there's often like a bit of water in them, and then you kind of a bit like a magpie, like, oh yeah, so I actually have just a stack of these, and they're very, very prevalent on the foreshore.
Cool. And the last one, do you have to clean the London clay before adding the oil, or can you dry it and use it straight?
Well, when I'm processing it, I always clean it. So I do that because maybe force of habit, but I have often just like, in my studio, I've got sacks of different colors which are all labeled, and occasionally I do want like a very like grainy or gritty texture, and I grab that and keep it like that. And yeah, you're going to get impurities in there, which like sand, silica, maybe a bit of chalk and stuff. So washing it will really bring out the that lovely kind of green gray color. But yeah, you can definitely just be more direct as well.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you.
So cool. And for those that have joined a little bit later, just to let you know that unfortunately Christine Rose Beers couldn't join us tonight because she has COVID and is very unwell at the moment. But we are definitely planning lots of more exciting events with Pigments Revealed International, where we'll definitely have more conversations and join you all in these conversations as well. Okay, so our next speaker tonight is Catalina. So over to you.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm sharing my screen.
Cool.
What's happening now? Can you see my full screen, or is cutting some of the letters? Is it fine?
It looks good to me. Yeah, it looks perfect.
Hello, my name is Catalina Christensen. I am an artist, an architect from Colombia, but living in London for the last 30 years. I am also one of the members of Pigments Reveal International, member of the board of Pigments Reveal International, and I'm delighted to do that. It's something I always dreamed when I was working with pigments. There were so many people that was working with pigments that I thought it would be lovely that we could communicate Then after the symposium, one day I was talking to Melanie and she said, this is the dream that I have. And I thought, this is brilliant because the possibilities that getting all of us together for education, for research, for collaboration, I mean, it's incredible. So I am very happy to be involved with PRI, as we say. For those that know me, I am totally passionate about pigment and has been that for many, many years. So I am a pigment maker and a pigment collector. The process of the pigments start with collecting the pigments. For me, the gathering and processing of pigments is an artistic endeavor in itself, and it's very important. So everything starts when going to a new place, and I'm very excited. I don't know what I'm going to find. And then you arrive to the place and you say, oh, it looks, there's very like just one tone. So as I approach, you start seeing a couple of rocks, and the excitement grows, and then you come closer. And this is from Colombia, where I started collecting. And as I look closer, this amount of color and beauty appears. So the decision is, okay, what am I going to take? Because I know they're all beautiful, but I don't want to take them all. I don't want to ruin the place by taking all the pieces. So I choose a few pieces. In other areas is more like earth, loose earth. So I will collect maybe a handful or two. And it's very important, if possible, to collect the exact location where I am collecting. So I go, and this is the kind of rocks that I can collect in one setting in Colombia. It's incredible what you can find. I collect the rocks, and I always come and give them a quick wash to get rid of insects and the dust. And then I divide the colors. I divide the rocks by color before I process them. I always keep a couple of samples as a reference before I grind the pigments. And then the process is a very simple process. Depending where I am, I use different tools, also depending on the type of rocks or material that I am collecting. So for example, in the middle, in the top, I found this green rock that the color was just in the surface. So I start using this metal grinder to take the color. When I am in Colombia, I love to use fossils, and if the material is a bit harder, I created these big rocks with a little hole to be able to grind easier. When it's more like loose earth, I found that using a metal rod, it was a very efficient way to grind the pigments. Once the pigment is ground, I divide it in the different particle sizes. And for that, I use these sieves, and I basically work mainly with 3 sizes. 70, in the bottom to the right, you see 67, 125, and 250 microns. This has something to do with the particle size. The top one where you see little rocks, I will only use that if I am making an installation, for example, but basically I use the last 3. I always wash my pigments. Why? Because I think that in that way I get a much more pure color, depending on what there is in the earth where I collect. It could be some, I don't know, chalk, other impurities, and there is always some organic material. So I put, once the pigment has been grinded in the different sizes, each size I wash separately. I put the pigment in a container and fill it with water and let it settle down. And I will do this several times until the water is almost completely clear. Oh, when it is completely clear, sorry. Once the water is completely clear, then the pigment is ready. So I put the pigment in slabs, let it dry, and then I do a final grinding. And for that, I had this, the top is a tool made from granite that is lovely for this process because it really fits my hand. And another tool that I found that is very effective is all irons that I can get in markets in France for 2 to 5 euros, and they are very good for this. So the pigment is ready. I have the different nuances that I collect. And then depending on what I'm doing, I am also starting to collect in other places. So I like to create like a series of charts with the different colors related to the different places. The one in the top is an area that has been completely destroyed, and I will never be able to collect pigments there anymore. So that's very important. The one in the middle was a collection in Hampstead Heath in the UK. And the one to the left is the pigments from Colombia, some of the pigments from Colombia. So I tend to collect the pigments and put them in bottles, keep the little rock, and then have a strip as a reference for each pigment. For me, the pigments are very, very precious, and I think that they should be stored in a precious container. So the first 3 that you see are the usual that you can buy, but then I started designing different containers for the pigments. And I was very lucky to find a person in Colombia that will blow each of them individually. I am very sad because since the pandemic, I haven't been able to get in contact with him. So I don't know what happened. Maybe I will never be able to get them again, but these bottles are very precious for me, and I use them to store the donations, the special pigments of when I display the pigments in different installations. So with the pigments, what do I do with them? I put them as part of the collection. I use them to create my works, whether they are like the 2 in the sides, whether they are paintings or whether they are 3D objects. And I also use them to display. For me, the pigments are as important as the paintings. So when I do exhibitions, if possible, I always like to make a display of the pigments. So these are basically the tools that I am using. You have the sieves, I have a collection of irons, different types of molars, and mustard and pestle. And I have one that Melanie really likes, I call the sock. And that I use when I am processing pigments in London. I don't want the studio to get full of dust. So I will put an old ski sock on top of the mortar and pestle, and then you can grind, and in that way, all the dust is contained within the sock. You just wash it, and then it's ready for next time. So one thing I would like to say is it's a very simple process. It's a process that had been done by humans for hundreds of thousands of years, and everybody can do it. If I can inspire anybody to play, even with air from the garden, to create their own pigments, I will be very happy, and then they can join us in this organization. And you don't even require special equipment. You can use kitchen tools. And like in Colombia, when I started working with fossils because that's all I could find, and a kitchen sieve. So everybody can do it. I think that's it for me today.
That's awesome, Catalina. Thank you. We have a question from Faye. I think I should say Faye. Do you cover the pigment when it's drying on the slabs to keep out dust, and how do you do that but also letting it dry at the same time?
I wait a little. Yes, if I am going to process it the next day, I don't cover it. But if I am not going to process it straight away, I will cover it with some paper or some old canvas until I can process it. You know, it depends, because in the studio that I am here, there is not much dust, so it's quite contained environment. When I am processing in Colombia, it's outdoor and there's lots of leaves and things falling. So it depends what I process, I will cover it or not.
We've got a comment from Angela saying a wonderful talk packed full of information. And yeah, and she's saying that she's a newbie to pigments, and I think that's the wonderful thing with this, is that we all coming from different perspectives. Some of us that have worked on a completely different thing for many years, and now that I mean, even for me, just suddenly this amazing world of making pigments and foraging pigments, it's very cool. So I feel you, Angela. I think it's great. It's really exciting, and I'm very jealous of all these amazing labs and studios that people have, of these years of work that they've been storing up these pigments. It's really exciting. And one day I'm sure we'll all meet each other and get to visit these amazing places. Cool. Okay, so then from Phil, does the color differ much or at all with different pigment size or particle size, I suppose?
It does change a little bit. It does change a little bit. Some are more intense the bigger the particle size. But actually, the earth pigments, I don't think they change very much. I didn't mention because I think it's something for another talk. But I also create what I call metal pigments that I use metal powders and I corrode them and I create pigments with them. With those, the bigger the particle size, the more intense the color, you know.
Oh, wow. I would have thought it would have been the opposite for some reason. I don't know why, like finer particle size.
For example, if you are using copper sulfate, that is a salt, when you corrode it, it can, if you grind it too much, it goes almost white. It loses the blueness because there's no reflection of light in the crystals. So that's why. I'm not a chemist though. I am not a chemist at all. I think that's the explanation.
Cool. That's great. And we've got Jamie Santiago joining from Colombia as well, saying thank you. It's really inspiring
nice.
too. Yeah. And Catalina, you're based in London at the moment?
Yes, I am.
You're based in London. And do you go to Colombia?
I go to Colombia to see my family, especially my mom. So I try to go, now that she's getting older, I try to go 2 times a year to Colombia. And then I spend a month there collecting, because I started collecting in Colombia. It's my special place to collect. So I like to be there working at least a month a year.
That's great. And then following on from that is, do you and any of the other panelists have workshops in London or nearish to London? And so, yeah, so it's great. I know the answer to that already. That quite a lot of you are around the UK.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, and then Catalina, can you tell us a bit more about your pigment collection that you've amassed from the UK?
The pigment collection started with pigments from Colombia. I don't know if you can see behind me. Can you see anything? I don't know.
Yes.
That's all the pigments. It started with pigments from Colombia, and initially there were 7 pigments. I don't know if I can do this. Is it possible? I don't know. Can you see those little photos? Okay. Yes. Those were the first 7 pigments that I collected. And one of the things that is incredible is that even though I go to places that are close to each other, the nuances are incredible. I collect and then you think, oh, it's the same color. And then when you come to the studio, you can have 7 different colors, very close to each other, which I find is fascinating. I have started collecting in the UK now and in Spain. So everywhere I go, if I can, I will collect rocks and try to create a little collection from that particular place. I have hundreds of pigments now.
Now we're getting lots of thank yous, and it's so interesting to see people's introduction to pigments as well, and something the Princess School of Traditional Arts with an introduction to pigment making with David Cranswick, which I know you've worked with him as well.
Maybe
We've
I
done
should
his
say,
course.
yeah, maybe I should say something about it, because I was, as I said before, I was working as an architect, and then I decided to do art. And very early on, I took a course with David about pigment making. And that's what gave me the idea, no, I don't want to do architecture anymore. I do a little bit, but I don't want to do that. And that's what made me desire to go to City and Guilds and do the BA in art, in art. So David has a lot to do with that.
And then I think a really good question, how do you navigate permission for transporting geologic materials across country borders?
I investigated, and there's no rules. As long as one of the reasons I watch them is you cannot transport organic material. That can be a problem. That is why I'm very careful of how I wash the rocks if I bring them and process, or the pigments. So I bring 20 kilos of pigment every time. I bring no clothes, I bring just pigments. And I have only been stopped once in Spain because I put some of the pigments in my hand luggage. Usually I put it in the whole luggage. And the guy said, what are you bringing there? Pigments, earth. I said, yeah, I'm an artist. And then I had my telephone, and then I opened my website and I say, this is what I do. And the guy was a bit confused. And I say, and there's no regulation. There's no prohibition to transport that. This is for my art and it's perfectly washed. And he said, oh, very nice. It looks very interesting. Okay, enjoy. No, never had a problem, never. Even transporting white pigments from Colombia had never had a problem.
That's great. So we're having quite a few questions about online courses and workshops, and I think that's something that we'll chat about a little bit later, I think, with all of us. But well, I'd like to move on now to the next speaker, who will be Caro. And yeah, over to you, Caro.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, Lucy and Catalina. I didn't really realize I was going to introduce myself. I'd sort of written about all sorts of other things, but not me. So to speak about me, it's kind of feels crazy, but I guess I'm interested in radical friendship and not strip mining either myself or people's ideas or the earth. I guess I'm a tributarian, so I do many things, but they're all fed from the same river. So professionally, I'm a Tai Chi teacher of 20 years odd. I've been doing Tai Chi since I was about 14. So I guess I'm an old Taoist bum. And I'm also an artist and studied painting at Chelsea School of Art, which is where I did my MA. Made dreadful installations and awful acrylic paintings. And then I joined a band and formed a record label and lived in a commune and did all sorts of things that led me to this living room of my friend. I used to have a pigment collection, but it burned down in a fire with my studio last May. So I'm now living in my hometown, which is wonderful and amazing. I'm about 200 meters from the sea. Right, I'm looking through the window, I'm looking at you, but I'm also looking at the sea, which makes me really happy, which is the view which all Goths like myself look at when they're either happy or sad as they grow up in Bournemouth. So I teach Wild Twins with the writer Paul Kingsnorth, which was our way to sort of rewild words and rewild art and somehow like bring all the materials together, bring ourselves together, bring the lost parts of ourselves back together. So my process of making paint is very much like Catalina's. My foraging aspect is very much as Lucy describes. I won't go into the details. One looks. There is a foraging eye that is nothing like the hunting eye. It's like a diffuse gaze. And I came into pigmenting through food, through hunger, through blackberries, through getting my hands absolutely covered in the juice of things in the countryside. So I grew up really near here, just a kilometre away. And we didn't have much money, so we were sent out to forage for blackberries to add to the apple pies on Sunday. And that's how I started picking things up. That was maybe when I was 5 with my brother, who was older than me, and making mud pies. That's how I got into pigments. Mud pies, apple pie. Shit, there's a pie context coming in here. I think food and art are of the same ilk. I think they are ways to bring people together. I think they are activities of the table. They are ways to host and guest. They are ways to feel great again when we have been lied to and told that the machine has no limits and will steamroll at everything we love. And I will not play that game. I'm 50 now and overjoyed to be even on a Zoom screen with a bunch of people who also love picking up a rock and going, woo! So this is what you do when you grow up by the seaside. You pick up rocks and shells and string them onto buckskin and craft things that make you feel whole. So I do make art, but I'm mainly making grave goods at the moment, which are the things that I hope to be buried with me. So they have to be non-toxic. So I can't sell them. Most of my work can't be sold. I can show it and I can use it. So I make a lot of oak gall ink, which I use on parchment, which I make from waste deer skins. So like Lucy, I love to use the waste stream. I store the feathers I find to make quills in this actual cod piece, which is made from waste cod skin. And I go around foraging for all the different wonderful galls that you can find on oak trees in Britain. And I still get excited about finding new ironstones. This was found in a place where I was on my honeymoon up the road, didn't go far. And it's a beautiful new ironstone, which I'm going to make pigment from this week. How I work is with pestles and mortars, with a mask on, usually working wet. And how I teach is with good precautions, but the minimum, so that people know they can do this at home. I'm fed up with the specialization of, I love the specialization of knowledge and I admire people who have it. I've also studied with David Krenswick and Daniel Chatto and loved every moment. But I'm really keen to not poison the land. So I stick away from the mercury and sulfur pigments and a couple of others, even though they make amazing colors, minium and lead white. And I have been drawn back to the earths, the ochres, the galls, the soot colors. This is seaweed charred in a box to make wonderful kind of silvery pigment. And I've got cochineal, which Julia sent me, which I absolutely love, which I'm addicted to. And this is a paint made from the Wild Pigment Project color this month, which is Spoils, which was from the Boyd Valley. And I've brought some lumps to show you in case any of you are actually subscribed. I thought I could actually show you the real thing. So this is what Otto the dog and me were gathering. And I think the thing this gathering does, both this gathering here, this moment, and the gathering of the earth and the gathering of myself together when I forage, it brings me back to my right mind. So it's a whole body activity. So I'm a Tai Chi person, but I've spent 25 years making literally no traces. And so when I make art, it's so good to make traces and to let them go out into the world. But I think that the gathering, the convening, the bringing together, and the not using ourselves up and not treating ourselves as a resource, but mindfully just taking what we need and using it, as Tilke Elkins described so well in her guidelines for ethical foraging. I think that this is, I'm happy to do that even while things are in collapse. I feel I can make this art with good heart, not be harming either myself or others, and that really matters to me. So I'm writing a book for beginners about this stuff now, just making natural paint. It's probably most of you will know all of it already, but it'll be good for our kids and for people who've never come to pigments before. So I guess that's me sitting in a room with a load of sticks and stones and rocks, which I'm pretty sure a lot of you are quite the same.
Yeah, I'd love to see everybody's rooms that they're sitting in now. I'm sure, like you said, a lot of us have all these things around us. But I love what you said. You know, I think coming from an archaeological perspective, we want people to leave things behind, but what we leave, you know, so that we can find out more and figure out more about what happened in the past. But it is such a different thing now, is how I mean, we're leaving so much behind that can't go back into nature. And so it's amazing to think about that process. Okay, so are there any questions?
Tammy, sorry,
yeah,
I should tell you something as my tame archaeologist then. The grave goods I'm making are a big joke so that future archaeologists, whether human, insectoid or AI, look at this crazy mixture of stuff and go, why is she buried with a Saxon, like an early Brythonic sword and a Saxon mug and a sort of Georgian era piece of jewelry? So it's going to be a big joke. You need to tell your future colleagues.
That's great. It's going to confuse us all.
Yeah.
Who was this woman?
A nutter, clearly.
That's great. I like that. Yeah, and I mean, it is great to think of that. Yeah, what is going to be? I mean, in another few thousand years, what is going to be left of us and the human race as we know it now? It's very interesting to think of. Wow. Okay, so let's go through these comments. Yeah, and also, yeah, not only pigments, but all the other things that you forage, like the feathers and the shells and the rocks. I think it's wonderful. And another was saying very new and very overwhelmed by all of this, but would really love to see the book. And I think that is one thing. I think a lot of the people here, I mean, I think many of you have written things or have these amazing projects that you're all part of, but everyone has a different perspective that they can lend. And so I think, yeah, it would be amazing to see your book, and I think it would help many people as well and inspire many people. So yeah, lots of wonderful work, and thank you, and fantastic talk. Then a question, I'm curious about all rock earth identification without a geology or science background, and Instagram is a great help, but do you use any other resources?
Myself, I use, luckily, Britain is really well geologically mapped, and there's that famous kind of, we have an incredibly various geology here, and it changes sort of meter to meter in some places, depending on whether the ice age got down as far as where we're at. But also, especially when it's things like this chalk, which was dug by a badger. This was my first thing for Ground Bright a few years ago, but there's scratches on it. And there's just nothing like the chalk. So there's a lot of places in Britain where it just can't be another thing. So you can find something and be sure of it. But elsewhere, I have not gathered yet. I've been sent amazing things, but I couldn't speak for another country. Here, it's quite clear off on what you're picking.
And then another question, what is your most treasured color and what is it derived from? I think I'd love to ask everyone here, but let's start with you, Cara.
You can't ask a pigment person that. That's like asking a mum which her favorite child is. Like, at the moment, it spoils. It's that one because it's got the one that has been sent out. It's got mica, and it's not pure. You know, it's post-industrial. It was found by my friend and his dog. I love painting with it. So yeah, this is my current favorite child, but don't tell the others.
Yeah, I think it's also an exciting thing when you find another pigment and find another way of making a beautiful pigment. It is a really exciting feeling. I like that. Then how do you know which soil is going to yield pigments? I'm interested in the science behind soil and pigment, and how do I get my hand on the subject?
I'd recommend people get in contact with and follow Ruthie Siddle, a Well Pigment Day, she's on Instagram and a wonderful geologist. I'm sure that she's here in Britain, but there are there's For the Love of Soil, there's so many people in the States as well and elsewhere, and people writing in Spanish. I wish I could read Spanish, I'm sorry I don't. So there's great people in South America also, but starting with the geology is good, yeah.
Yeah, it's one thing at the Pigments Revealed International at the symposium as well. I think it was Karen Vaughan, the For the Love of Soil, who spoke about that she loves brown, you know, and it was this amazing thing that, you know, that there's just in every color there's so much variation, and there's so much to learn from soil and from rocks and from everything around us, which is quite exciting. And from what I've learned so far about all these pigment people is that everyone is so willing to share their knowledge and share their pigments when they can, which is really exciting. Okay, there's a nice link in the chat as well. It's a useful link if you're in the US. Thank you, Panu. So now I'd like to pass over to Mia, so our last speaker, and then we're going to still have some Q&A afterwards. But yeah, over to you, Mia.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about, I'll share my screen, microbial pigments. Let's see, full screen. Oh, just a moment. Can you see the full screen?
Yes, that looks good.
Great. So, so I'm actually a microbiologist and biochemist, and but I have a love of pigments. So I'm also out there enjoying looking for pigments in any form, and I happened to be working on microbial pigments before, but it was not something I really linked with pigments as we know them or think about them until a couple of years ago, when I just started getting more interested in the background of the materials I was using, and then just became completely hooked on pigments in every shape and form. So I want to tell you, there were so many topics that I was thinking about that I was excited to share with everyone. And so there's so much in the microbial world that could be interesting for pigment people. But I'm going to tell you a bit about the work and the kind of work I've done on microbial pigments, and also share a few topics of research others have done that I think will be interesting to this community. So, and I included this microbial painting. Unfortunately, it's not one of mine. Mine were never quite as impressive as this one here. I'm not sure who the artist is, but it was featured on the American Society for Microbiology Facebook. And once a year, they always have a competition for microbial art. So people in the lab get very creative, and there's some really amazing things that they draw with their microorganisms. So let's see. So there's a lot of color coming from visible microorganisms. So for example, the mushrooms we see, and there's a lot of people on Instagram and the internet where you can, like the mushroom color atlas and things like that, where you can really see that there's so much you can do with microbial color. And so there's the mushrooms and lichens, and this is a picture I took recently of a very old fort in the Netherlands, and you can see that this is a limestone wall where all sorts of life is growing all over it. So in the top left corner, you can see some of the restoration work, but all the older pieces that are at least 300 years old, you can see that there's mosses growing and all sorts of other microorganisms. And you can see a really wide range of colors showing up. So I tried to take some samples of that, so I hope I'll have time to isolate some. But there's also other very visible displays of color from microorganisms that you might be familiar with, like the bioluminescence at a beach, or iron bacteria in streams and different places. So there's a very visible microbial presence that we can see in our daily lives. But what I work on is the more invisible microorganisms. So these microorganisms, we generally isolate, you can isolate them from anywhere, but most of the ones we work with are from the soil. So this is me actually looking for pigments, but I'm also interested in the microorganisms associated with these pigments. So what I love about these invisible microbes is that you can start with something, and like we just talked about, there's a huge array of even browns in soil that might look uninspiring to some people. And even though it looks like just brown, when you isolate it, especially in the lab, and get these single species and single organisms isolated out of that tiny piece of soil or ocean or from wherever you have a sample, you can get a wide range of organisms that are producing a whole rainbow of colors. And so this picture I really liked. It's not one of mine, but I just really liked the way they presented this. And you can see that these are in the circle is a petri dish with the microorganisms growing, and you can see the colors that they're producing, and they've just shown some close-ups of the individual colonies that are growing on this petri dish. And I just really think it's amazing that this unseen world, that when you zoom in on it and start working on it, you can get such an explosion of color that in the first instance, you know, you wouldn't suspect there's anything more to it. So what I worked on was very very scientifically looking at and understanding the biochemistry and the genetics related to pigment production. And the main reason is that a lot of these pigments are antibiotics. So that's actually the main reason we were trying to understand how these pigments are produced and why, so that we can find new sources of medically relevant compounds. And so here we have an isolate of a bacteria, Streptomycetes. It's actually one of the bacteria that also give the earthy smell when you walk in the forest after the rain, for example. And under some conditions, when you just grow it, it makes these gray spore pigments. It starts out a bit white and then starts going grayer. But if you play with the light, the temperature, so the food you give it, the sugars, different types of minerals, iron, copper, different things. If you play with pH, you can play with oxygen, for example, the presence of plant materials, the presence of other microorganisms, all these things, it will sense their presence and in some way react. And often that reaction is the production of antibiotics, and most of these have colors. For example, so this single strain, a species, can produce these blue dots that it makes little droplets of on top of it, of the cells, but also internally, this is a cross section of a bacterial colony, as we call it, and you can see the red pigment being formed inside. So, and actually this species, it's Streptomyces, and it's called sillicolor, which is, so it's named after this blue color, which resembles the blue color of the sky. And some of the bacteria you'll come across are even just called purple bacteria, because as everyone, we really, no matter what you're doing, everyone can identify with color and relates to color. And I think that's also something that's really, it really helps to engage in sciences and our environments from all ages and backgrounds. And so to go back to this slide, though, you can see on the right side, so here it's the same bacteria, and I was just playing here with different concentrations and types of sugars, and everything else in the experiment stayed the same. And you can see that there's a variety of colors popping up. So from reds and purples and pinks associated with this red pigment to different shades and amounts of blue. It can make these white sort of pigment and can go towards different shades of gray. So I really tried in my work to understand what we can do to improve the pigment production, and also to understand which and how many pigments or other compounds one strain can produce, because generally a lot of these strains can produce up to 20 to 30 different compounds. A lot of them have pigments, but in lab conditions we might not see that. And then a lot of approaches use just general a single isolation, and so like in the previous slide, they test a single condition, and in some cases you don't see anything interesting. So for example, in this top image, you might think it doesn't produce anything of interest, but when you really start to understand the genetics and the requirements and the different growth conditions, you can really get a rainbow of colors. So I really love this image. This is actually from a scientific paper, and so I adapted it a bit, and but I really like the Munsell inspired image showing the rainbow of colors from different types of microorganisms. But what I think is also very important to mention here, and which I've also touched upon, it's very important to respect that these pigments are very interesting, but that it's important to keep in mind that they often have a very specific function for the microorganisms. And that can be something like an antibiotic or another chemical function or medical function in our case, but that you respect that if you are able to work with something like that, that you really need to know what kind of functions it has. And that's always something to keep in mind, that, for example, if you are able to isolate a pigment from a microorganism and it does have an antibiotic function, that's not necessarily something you want to spread more widely because of resistance and things like that. On the other hand, there are people that are also trying to incorporate antibiotic pigments into, for example, as textile dyes, so that you have some sort of antibiotic properties that are mixed into the material already. I'm not sure magically that that really works, but I think it's interesting ways of different approaches and different ways of thinking about pigments and their functions and their uses. But microbial pigments are definitely something that's starting to come up. There's a few companies now working on it, and there's different groups around the world doing research on this. But it's still definitely an under-explored resource. And there's a lot of potential for sustainability and circular economy. So what is really great about the use of microbiology for production of things is that you can often couple different activities. So you can couple, for example, a waste stream as a feeding stock for your pigment production. So you can get rid of the waste and transform it into a pigment. There's also a lot of microorganisms being used to develop systems to biologically degrade harmful dyes from, for example, the textile industries. But what's also important is looking at microbial pigments that actually have the potential for biodegradation, so that what's put out in the world you can recycle and reuse or turn into something else. So I think there's a lot of fun things that are starting to happen now with the pigment world from the microbiology view, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I'm really excited to see, I really like discovering sort of the different colors you can get from one single strain, but I'm also really interested in what kind of microorganisms you can find associated with what we consider more classic pigments, like earth pigments. And so now what I do is I try to collect earth pigments, though in the Netherlands it's not as inspiring as in some like in Colombia, like Catalina showed us. But I try to collect these samples and also save some of the sample and hopefully start isolating some of the microbes and seeing what's in there and what pigments of their own they produce. And as a last little thing, I wanted to show some work from others that have been working on microbes and specifically earth pigments. So this paper discusses how hunter-gatherers harvested microbial-based iron oxides to produce their rock art. And this paper I really enjoyed. So they identified the sources of different ochres in art from Australia by actually identifying the microorganisms from these pigments. So they identified the types of microorganisms that they found in the artifacts, and they could couple those back to the origins, the geological origins of the ochres. So I'm really excited to see this sort of shift in a lot of different areas related to microbes and pigments and things like that. So yeah, I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Cool. Thanks, Mia. Wow, it's a whole nother world.
Yeah.
So you've got quite a few questions. So also just looking at how do you actually harvest the microbes? Like if you're wanting to get the get them off the limestone that you said, for example, how do you actually harvest them?
So what I generally do is, so if it's something growing on top of something, you can just sort of scrape it off with a tissue or something. But the problem that always remains is it's very hard to work sterilely. And of course, there's like, if you would just hold out your hand, there's microbes even floating in the air. And so you can't always be completely sure that what you're getting is only what's growing there, but also just from their environment. So that can be a bit tricky, but that's why you have to try and isolate multiple different strains. It's not the first come, first serve of what you isolate. But for example, if you have a rock and you want to see what's associated with the rock rather than the surface, you really want what's inside. So before you really start grinding the rock or anything like that, you really want to make sure that the outside has been sterilized as much as possible so that you're only dealing with what's internally stored inside the rock or soil or whatever else you're working with.
Yeah. Then just so two people asking about how light fast microbial pigments are.
It really varies. I think most of them would be more considered dyes than pigments, though there are pigments as well. And in a lot of cases, yeah, there's work being done on it, but it's not something I've directly looked into. I think it really depends on the specific pigments. It's there's no general rule to it, I think.
How do you start growing microorganisms in Petri dishes?
So pretty much you need agar or some other jelly-like material that they can grow on, or you can also do it in liquid in a flask. And then you need to try and figure out what they might like to eat. So what kind of sugars, what kind of minerals and things. But you can also just leave out, for example, a bowl of soup or something, and you'll always see something growing. So what they want to eat really depends on what you're isolating. But I mean, there's even microbes being isolated from volcanic sources, so it really varies. But generally, if you just have some sort of jelly, and what you can do is you can dilute your sample in water, and you really only need a little bit of sample will go really a long way. If you have your jelly, and then you can plate it out on that, so you can just pour it on or something and it'll grow. But the problem remains, ideally you want to work in a clean environment. So if you leave the Petri dish open and you're pouring stuff and then you walk away and you come back, anything from the air will fall on it as well.
Sure. This is very fascinating. I'm going to be thinking very differently about mold and
Yeah.
things around me now. Can you speak to the specific elemental structures of the different color microbial pigments, such as carbon or iron oxides?
A lot of them are, a lot of them are sort of, especially the antibiotic ones, are very complex molecules that are sort of, they're very large molecules. So it's a lot, it's not something you can compare to, for example, iron oxides, but there are a whole range from more simple chemicals, such as iron oxide or iron related compounds that are more simple, to really, really complex chemical compounds, which are just, I don't even understand them. Like they're actually quite big molecules with a lot of different elements. So there's really a broad range.
Sure. Then are there systematic colors which come from these specific functions of the microorganisms?
What do you mean with that?
Not
Do you
sure.
know?
So that's Sabine, I don't know if you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, iron oxide tends to be red, for example, so can you sort of say, oh, it's an antibiotic because it's blue?
No.
I was just curious.
Unfortunately not. So that blue one, that blue antibiotic actually can be red or blue depending on pH, for example. So that organism we use a lot because the antibiotics are pigmented. So to understand when antibiotics are produced or not, under which conditions, we can use the colors, which is great. But some of them are clear, or it depends on pH, or so. Because the chemistry is so varied from these pigments, it could be just that the organism is involved with iron oxides to the production of these very complex chemicals, like antibiotics or other things. Like there's no clear-cut answer to that. Yeah.
And just a comment from Tilke, just amazing about breaking down industrial dyes with microbes that then make another microbial color. Sure, it is.
Yeah,
it's
it's really amazing. I was working on actually microbial degradation of plastics, and a lot of degradation of dyes from textile industry came up when I was working on that as well. And it's really amazing. Microbes are so versatile. Like there's nothing they can't do. They're nature's little factories, and they know much better than we do what's possible and what's not. And it's up to us to sort of find the solutions to the problems we've created, I think. And I think the little microbes are our great friends. It's just figuring out how to do it well. And one of the great things about microbes is that you can do a lot of complex chemistry, which would, for example, be needed to degrade these textile dyes. But you can do the same chemistry with a microbe and using less water, using a lot less energy, no harsh chemicals. So it's just about figuring out the process. And it's still actually early days of biotechnology and microbiological processes, that there's a lot of research in getting these things started. It's just there's not that much effectively happening yet, but I think there's a really promising future to it.
And then just a comment from Terry about how to get the article. I'm guessing it's in Nature, so it should be available online, but maybe only for academic networks.
Depends which one. But
Is it the Brandy? I'm not sure, Terry, is it the McDonald article about the hunter-gatherers?
But if you send me a message, I mean, most should be open access, and if they're not, I'm happy to send you the articles. So if you just send me a message in the chats, I'll copy down your information and then send it to you.
And I know also in Pigments Revealed, I know some of your members as well, but Melanie has this amazing collection of papers, this amazing archive of information that you'll have access to as a member as well. And so we'll upload these cool articles too.
And I'm working on adding the microbial side, but I need to find a way of archiving it properly because at the moment it's just a huge mess.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Mia a few more questions, but please post questions as well for any of the other speakers or any other general comments that you'd like to make. Then just two questions. What inspired you to get into this research? And also just given a little idea of the hardware, the technology that you use to monitor and analyze your data.
So I just rolled into the research originally. I really like fundamental research, so really trying to understand nature, but that there's some sort of use to it, that it's not, I don't mind getting into really like the hyper focus niche within a science, but I like that that people outside my lab can relate to it, or at least understand in global pictures what I'm working on. So of course the colorfulness and like working with at least these bacteria, these Streptomyces bacteria, they really just engage all your senses. You walk into the lab and it smells like a forest, and there's colors everywhere and stuff growing everywhere, and then some people trying to like have microbes fight each other to see who will produce something interesting, or someone else is either cutting up a plant or trying to grow the microbes with a plant and then extracting pigmented things. So I think it seemed like a fun project, and actually I did my master's project with that group and I just really liked it and then rolled into it. And at the time I didn't really think about pigments specifically until I started thinking about earth pigments, and then realized like, hey, this comes together and brings my interests all together, and there's more to this than just the very basic science of it. And in the sense of tools and instruments, there's a lot you can do at home or in a makeshift lab. There's a lot of, also I know at least in the Netherlands, there's a lot of artists and designers and sort of general public working on microbiology at home. And there's a lot of things you can get. The things I find most important is to be aware of safely working with microorganisms, because like with a lot of pigments, people will think, well, it's natural, so it's safe, but that's definitely not the case. And that you're aware that sterility, or that your environment contains a lot of microorganisms. So if you want to isolate something specific, that you're aware that you can contaminate your samples, but also to be aware that, you don't necessarily need exotic samples to get something interesting. Like, I forgot what the statistics are, but like a single droplet of ocean water holds, I don't know, more microorganisms than there's people on the earth, something like that. So there's a lot you can do at home. I mean, in the lab, we have like very big fermentation reactors, so really big liquid cultures that we use to produce a lot of pigment, which you can then isolate. And we use a lot of rudimentary isolation, so chromatography, so you have a big column, and use particle sizes to separate it, and evaporation and things like that. But there's also the really industrial high scale methods. So it really depends what you're interested in, what you want to work on. I know a lot of places also, for example, they'll just throw some textile or paper in with a culture of a growing organism and just let the paper or the textile absorb the color and things like that. So there's a huge array of options.
Yeah, and then just another comment about the distinctive smells of microbes. And I think, I mean, that's something that also comes into earth pigments sometimes, that you have certain shales even that you when you're grinding it, you get these interesting smells coming out, and it's because there's still things living in them, or I mean, even irons that you get that strong, almost smell like blood. So it's very interesting.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues, I worked more on really understanding the production of these compounds within species rather than looking for new strains. But one of my colleagues, she isolated one, and it had this really strong garlic smell, for example. So we weren't the biggest fan of that one, but it's really an amazing world.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 10 more minutes left. So I'd like to open the floor. If anyone else has questions, you can either say it to us verbally, just unmute yourselves, put up your hand and unmute yourself, or put in a question. As I know, Lucy, you earlier had a question for Cara about that, just thinking about wanting to leave no trace, and it's that interesting concept of what brought you to that thinking about that. I don't know if we want to start with that.
But they leave no trace. In Britain, generally, it's impossible to leave no trace. So I can't speak for another country or another continent, or even just on the mainland of Europe. But this tiny archipelago of 1,000 islands is completely walked all over by hobnail boot blokes many, many, many centuries before I got here. So I generally pick up from waste streams like Lucy does, and I take from things that people have already dug. I happily walk on rich landowners' land and take things I probably shouldn't. And you can't get me for that, because I'm not going to show you them. And I think that it's time lower class women like myself reclaim land. And I'm never going to own it because I'm not rich. So my views about foraging in my home countries, which are Scotland and England, are different from what I would be if I were a guest in your countries. So I'm very, very context specific, but sometimes you've got to have an edge. And actually here, class is still a really big thing, and I'm really happy to mess that up a bit. So the context for me in my land is utterly different. So I would encourage everyone to really research their own context. And I'm a woman of a certain age, so I have an attitude and I'm happy to own it. But I was much more well-behaved when I was younger, and I didn't have as much fun or as many pigments. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Cool. And a nice question from Faye, that a complete newbie here, and I'm having a major block with figuring out where to forage. So she's in the American Southwest, incredible geology, but wanting to forage ethically and legally. So I don't know if any of you have any advice. So not looking at things where you're near to certain lands, roads, mines, and railways, things like that. So I don't know if any of you can offer advice. I don't know, Melanie, maybe in the States.
I'll connect her with some people that can help her and have her go from there.
Cool.
There are a couple of people in that area. There are also a number of people who are part of PRI or that I've worked with in other ways who can talk to you about ethical foraging.
Cool. So Faye, if you want to, you can unmute yourself and talk if you would like to. Cool.
Hi, so I'm Faye. Thanks, folks. I've researched online. I've definitely read the Wild Pigment Project guidelines. Melanie, thank you. I know we've been emailing a bit, but not about specifics on where to collect. But basically, I'm here in Arizona and everything is owned. I'm a renter. All the parks, everywhere I hike, everywhere I camp. I mean, I love the outdoors, but it's either city, state, it's a national park. And I've researched, and all of those places say specifically, do not take any stones, do not take any dirt, do not take any plants, etc. The only place I found where it's mostly legal is I went into the BLM office and was like, can I collect for personal use? And yes, I hope to sell these paintings because they also have guidelines around like, you can't use it commercially. So I'm like, where are you people where are you able to go outside and pick up a rock and take it home?
One of my favorite places is just alongside the road, you know, especially if they're doing any new construction, if they're putting in a new road and they cut through a bank or something. I mean, those are fantastic places to look for pigments. If they're putting in new housing development, go before they actually start building while they're still doing the dirt work and see what you can find there. I mean, Arizona is just, the colors down there are spectacular.
Yeah, but those places are all owned by the city.
A lot of building sites, like where they're putting in housing developments, that land is owned, but if you go and you talk to the contractor, a lot of times they'll let you come on after hours and gather stuff. I've asked permission for that before, and you don't need to ask anybody's permission to pick stuff up out of the ditch.
Okay.
And if somebody says you do need permission, I have some words for them.
So what about I mean, I think this was also mentioned maybe that collecting along roadways can be really, really contaminated. Your materials can be super contaminated by traffic.
You know, I've had people collect for me in Utah for years, and I have not seen any difference in the pigments I get from there compared to the pigments I get from, say, Oregon. You know, whether it's next to the road or out in the middle of the desert or in the forest. Ultimately, everything is contaminated with something else. I guess we just have to, you know, pick our poisons and try and work with them. I do know that there are places in Arizona where you can forage without having to ask permission. I've got a cousin who lives in Bisbee, and I'll ask him, where are you in AZ?
I'm in Tucson, so not too far from Bisbee.
There's some gorgeous collecting in the hills around Bisbee. There's also an incredible defunct copper mine in Bisbee that you need to go and look at. It will blow your mind.
And a nice suggestion also to look at Wild Pigment Project. It has some nice guidelines for newbies. Yeah. We've got quite a lot of questions, so I just want to go through them all. A question on how do you clean up after making paints? So working with iron-rich rocks, but concerned about iron going down the drain. Maybe Catalina can offer something on that, or Lucy. Are you on mute? Is she on mute?
Usually when I wash my pigments, what is left, I put it in the garden, in my plants. So I don't put it in the drain, because then I don't think it's a problem. I don't know, what do you do, Lucy?
Yeah, if it's earth colors, then I have a pile in the garden where I just pour it out, and it goes back into the earth. So
yeah. Exactly.
I like that.
I don't really put anything much down the drain. I have a pile of scrap paper, and I clean off my boards and slabs straight onto cartridge paper, onto scrap paper, and into sketchbooks, which are empty, and the pages fill up with multicolored grounds. So by the time the slab gets to my washing up, it's got almost nothing on it, which I then tissue off, which goes in the bin. And then the earth pigment, tiny residue, is absolutely fine. I mean, it's just dirt, and that's going into the drains. But generally I make a pile of papers, and then I use them for collage and for drawing on. And because it makes me happy.
And one more thing is when I paint, I change from oil painting. I move to egg tempera. So there's no terps or anything. So it's no problem at all. That was one of the reasons I moved from oils to egg tempera.
And then there's some questions here. Sorry, Lucy, do you want to say something else?
I make a lot of copper-based pigments like verdigris, and I do make sure that I don't pour the residues of that ever down the drain. I just let the water, if I'm mixing my brushes and water, I let the water completely evaporate off, and then I'm just left with the solid residue, and I just put that into a jar and keep it safe there, away from anything.
Cool. And then just some questions on pigments from plants, but also interested in making paints and inks with pigments. Do you know where I can source where I can go to learn the ins and outs? And I know, just thinking of inks, I just immediately think of the Toronto Ink Company and Jason Logan. But I don't know if there's any other suggestions in terms of plant dyes and looking at inks. Anyone?
Natalie Stopka is doing a lot with lakes. And you can, oh, she's here. Hi, Natalie. And of course, Jason Logan with inks, also Thomas Little, who is just a complete modern alchemist, or maybe not even modern. I don't know. Thomas is just so cool and wonderful and freaky and just amazing. He's on Instagram under a rural RURAL.pen. Carol does inks. Annie Hogg does inks.
I found these amazing books recently. Do you guys know those? I don't know if you've seen them. There's a colleague who I'd worked with in Dark Mountain. She goes under Majnuna on Instagram, but these books are great and they intersect between plants color. They're all from the Middle East, so they're Persian colors and early kind of Islamic colors and East of Europe colors, and they're great. Lots of lakes, lots of kind of old recipes, and I thoroughly recommend those. That's Jumana Medlej. I'll put that in the chat for everyone, but really recommended. She publishes them themselves, but that's what that kind of the things those questions asked for are definitely in here. She makes great colors.
Great. And there's some other really nice comments as well, and some other answers to questions and conversations. So make sure you have a look at the chat. And for those of you that have asked Mia to send the paper, just please make sure to leave your email address as well. Then there's so many, I don't know how to get through them all, but lots of thank yous and some really nice advice. Anyone that maybe, I'm not sure, Melanie, if you want to get in direct contact with people, but looking for good places to forage in Northern California near San Francisco.
That's Heidi Gustafson's territory.
Okay, cool. So she's a good.
You cannot go wrong if you're doing anything with Heidi. I will take the chat, and any questions that aren't answered here tonight, I'll send them to the correct person and they can get back to you. I'll also take the information and put it on the website so that you can, find the different links that we've talked about and stuff. And like the 2 books that Carol just recommended.
Cool. And there's some great suggestions, just looking at all these links that people have posted and different places to look at. But yeah, what this makes me realize that there really is so many questions and so much more that I think we'd all like to talk about. So I'm quite excited to what with all different organizations, but specifically within Pigments Revealed International and PRI, that we're going to hopefully facilitate a lot more of these. And we just invite you to please get in contact with us if you would like to get involved in any way or have a great idea for a workshop or a talk. That's exactly what we want. And like Melanie has said, that for many years she worked alone in this, and it's so wonderful to have this community that we can share all this knowledge with. So it's very exciting. So yeah, I don't know if there's any closing remarks or any comments or last questions.
I just wanted to let everybody know that now that we've opened membership, we are looking for volunteers to help work on programming and content. You can look on the website. There's a new page that says volunteers at the top, and there's a list of some of the things that we need people to help with. You're welcome to, there's a little form that you could just check the boxes of things that you're interested in, and we'll get in touch with you. It would be wonderful to have everybody here, you know, joining us and working on different things together.